Hey everybody, welcome to week 248. Sorry, my fault. We're 2 minutes late. I was telling stories about my eye surgery yesterday, but anyway, we're here. 248, and if you haven't got the message in 2 weeks, you think about what's 248 plus 2, Adam?
250.
Oh, there you go. You got to have a CPA on board to add those numbers together. But
Yep.
so our 250th week anniversary is going to be live. We'll be still broadcasting for anybody that is either too lazy or too far away or can't join us in person. But if you can, we would love to have you at the Hamilton um, by the Music Factory, and it's always a fun time. 11 a.m. is when we're wheels up, so 10:30 roll in. We got Dunkin' Donuts stuff, and the Dunkings are going to be there. So anyway, it'll be fun and frivolity, and we're looking forward to having anybody that shows up. So speaking of showing up, what about tariffs? So we're going to be talking about that, legal agreements, like what do you do? Because I was even talking with somebody this week about they've got a client that's doing a lot of importing from Canada. And so, hey, she's having to deal with a lot of that. So, before we unleash Jack, Adam, I'm sure you've got a ramble or a diatribe.
Um, Shockingly, not much of one because I'm gonna have a diatribe on the topic.
Okay.
So I'm gonna save it for my opening. Well, Jack, what a fine mess we're in now. Questions that I'm gonna have for Jack, but now that I mean you you've heard on the if you've been following the news, um, that in theory, the Department of Education is next on the list for the Doge cuts, and then there's a targeted 50% headcount reduction at the IRS after that. Um, you know, I, I don't really know what to say about it other than it just means that service is going to suck. So
As if it didn't already.
yeah, they did. I mean, going back to, hey, we're going to abolish the IRS and then have, a national sales tax or whatever. It's like, just to put that in context, it means that the sales tax would have to be about 40%. So I mean, I guess you could sort of make an argument, well, isn't that kind of, our all-in tax rate today anyway, just switch to a consumption tax, maybe, but it just, I don't see a lot of change in there. So this feels a little bit more like one of those, hey, shock and eyes, let's make some cuts, see what happens, and then try to put it back together if we broke it afterwards, type of moves. And there's kind of, there's cases for that. Well, it's funny because in theory, there's not too much of a case against it, because if you just keep on removing people, and then you still function, then that's not a bad strategy. There's a human element to this, but it's overall not a bad strategy. Because I don't know about Shoemaker, Jack, but at BGW, like, nobody ever said, Gary, I really don't have a lot to do, so you should really just eliminate my job.
Right.
If I were you for the day, what I would do is I would eliminate me, because I'm really not doing anything value added. Said no one at BGW ever. And, maybe, again, my heart goes out to the families of people that were laid off, and at the same time, at the macro level, it's like, what, was it all value added to the government? And cuts needed to happen. In other words, like, you can't out of one side of your mouth said we need to cut the budget without acknowledging that part of that will have to be headcount reduction, because that, personnel costs, regardless of department, is a pretty significant portion of what we spend the money on. In other words, like, it's not, federal government's not going to be radically different from any organization. Labor is going to be 25 to 50%. So it's like, you can't say, well, let's cut everything but people. It's like, you can't cut, so like it was going to happen, and it just sucks when it does happen. But anyway, that's my tirade, if that made any
Yeah,
sense.
that's good. I am going to add one additional thing. Hey, how about having those astronauts back? I mean, can you imagine? You think it's like the Gilligan's Island 3 hour tour. Oh, well, it's like 9 months later. Like how, I still wonder, like how do you function? And evidently they had enough food and that sort of thing. But man, holy moly, I'm just grateful to have them back. I think that's a pretty cool public-private sector joint venture, if you will, or collaborative effort. And I'm a big collaborator, so I think that's pretty cool.
Do you
So
know if it's true or not that, where they were up, what, 8 months or so, that
yeah,
biologically they did not age 8 months because of either lack of gravity or atmosphere or whatever it is? I don't know if that's fact or fiction. If that's cool, that's cool if it is.
I
But
don't
okay.
know.
You hadn't heard that? Okay.
But I mean, if you look at them when they got out of that capsule, like standing, all of a sudden you're back in gravity. They're like, yeah, So um, I saw the headline of an article. I didn't have time to read it, but I'm going to. But just about what they're physically going to have to deal with. So I'm sure there's something there. How much? Oh, have you heard how much they get paid for an extra 8 months space pay? Great question, Joseph. I have no idea, but I'll bet ChatGPT has it.
All right. So we want to get into it. And well, first of all, thank you
Yeah,
for
you've got to have something.
the world of karma for getting my Tar Heels through that stupid game that they had to play in. I mean, I guess I should be thankful that they were, at least invited into, and all the controversy that our AD had to take as being the head of the selection committee. But, he stepped out of the room. So everything's okay then, right? Yes, says every Tar Heel ever. So, um, so anyway, so Friday at I think 3:40-ish or so, then we'll, hopefully prove that we should have been in the tournament to begin with, despite our play during the past several months. Um, not much has changed on the Corporate Transparency Act. Interest rates, I believe, are unchanged. I don't think they've made any changes nor anticipate any changes in the near future. And so let's talk about tariffs. And we previously talked about kind of what they are and how they impact. And so now kind of the next kind of natural focus is on what you might be able to do about it. And, I've been reading about, possible solutions to that, partially for curiosity, partially because my clients expect me to be doing things about that in their contracts where they can. And there is a significant misconception that the starting point is the force majeure clauses in your contracts. And the reason why that is not the real starting point or a valid starting point is because the concept of force majeure, and we've talked about this before. So the concept of force majeure is to say that we, prior to signing an agreement, we've analyzed the situation, we've thought about the possibilities, realistic possibilities, not the crazy ones that World War III breaks out, but, war is a force majeure event typically. But that, and we understand there's going to be blips and things like that. Some have used force majeure, tried to use force majeure to deal with the tariffs and say that, well, this was unanticipated. So the force majeure clause kicks in. The typical force majeure clause will say something along the lines of, Well, in the case of a force majeure event, and many times it will define what that is, and sometimes very specifically. I'll give you an example. So I represent a multi-unit, multi-brand franchisee in the country of Honduras, which maybe many of you know, but I didn't recall this until I started doing work for them. Honduras is still a communist country. And so, if government wants to take something, they're going to take it. And so trying to navigate through commerce issues there and making a US franchisor understand those things is somewhat difficult. So there's a lot of negotiation within the force majeure clause as to what concept that is. Give you another example. In another country, getting US currency is limited. So companies cannot convert the local currency into US currency to then send it to a franchisor. And the franchise agreements will say US currency, US currency, US currency. So how do you deal with that? You say, okay, it's okay in local currency, or do you deal with a situation that is a force majeure situation? So you may recall also back in the COVID days that the force majeure clauses were used for that. And then how that evolved over the course of time is, all right, now we understand the impact of something like COVID. We can anticipate what might happen to supply chain and things like that because we've been through it. So then the question is that truly a force majeure event if we know that it is a possibility down the road? So then the flip side of that is, well, okay, force majeure event, you have an obligation to pay rent, you have an obligation to pay royalties, you have an obligation to pay, regardless of what's going on. So if you look at your lease, it likely says that if it has a force majeure clause in it, that not paying your rent or not paying what you're supposed to pay is not excused because of a force majeure event. Another provision that is heavily negotiated by me and others is that, okay, well, if you cannot pay because you're not making money, then shouldn't that not be a force majeure event or something that interrupts the business flow? The challenge with, let's say, in a franchise arrangement, royalties is derivative of revenue. If you don't have revenue, then you're not paying royalties unless there's a minimum royalty clause. So you can see how force majeure is helpful, but it can evolve over the course of time that what might have been a force majeure event in the past may not be a force majeure event in the future or be allowed to be interpreted that way because we know the possibilities now and we know the impact of that. And that is, so it doesn't fall within the concept of a force majeure provision because it is to deal with the unanticipated or the unexpected. Now, throw tariffs into everything that I just said in the background. And so what do you do with that? And there have been attempts to, as I said, use the force majeure clause. And I pulled some information, and this was an article that talked about force majeure in recent cases. And it actually goes back several decades and then comes to present. And it was, the section was tariff-induced price increases, legal precedents, and challenges. And it focused more sort of on historical because, as you might imagine, the whole concept of tariffs and whether it's legal, not legal, really hasn't worked its way through the court system sufficiently to be able to say, okay, this is kind of but we can extrapolate from the past as to what might a court interpret and attempt to use a force majeure clause to somehow modify the obligations that are under the contract. So there was one case in Louisiana that the use of force majeure was denied because simply being deprived of anticipated profits does not establish commercial impracticability. That's another concept which is related to force majeure, but the inability or impracticability of one or both or several of the parties to perform on a contract is also a form of force majeure, but it's a different legal concept in equity. And so you'll see that the legal precedents will say like an 86% increase in price did not establish force majeure commercial impracticability, and talk about, so price increases is the focus here, and in various industries, so steel industry, printing, there was a medical lab, and they talk about, all these things that the claim of force majeure or the inability to perform, therefore excusing the performance, is permitted. And in all these cases, it was denied. So, that's just a demonstration as to how that's just not going to work for various reasons. It was tried in the past, specifically with tariffs. It's been tried for things like COVID, probably was tried for flu epidemics and those kind of things, but we still put in, it's not as if, well, we started at the beginning of COVID to put in force majeure clauses, epidemics, pandemics. Then it was, okay, as declared by a US certified agency or an international agency as a pandemic or epidemic. And then it was, okay, well, it really doesn't matter because you can put it in there, but it's going to be interpreted as being an invalid provision. So that's the evolution of that. So let's talk about what you can do well, let me stop there and see if, either Adam or Gary wants to input anything or on any of that historical stuff before we start talking about preventative maintenance of your contracts.
Not, I guess more of just probably less of a question, just of like a practical example of like, hey, how this kind of sucks, like regardless of your philosophy. I will not name names, Gary, but this is a guy who was at the inauguration. So super clear who he voted for. Owns a manufacturing company in Canada that he buys product from. So, and has bank debt associated with the acquisition. So like he's got to pay the bank off the profits of this company. So overnight, all of a sudden he's got a 25% tax on the goods that he's buying from himself.
Wow.
There's no, like in his particular case, it's like, I don't see a scenario where it's feasible. In other words, like, I don't see how he could move production to the US. Like, I'm sure it's like theoretically possible, but not practical. And he doesn't, like, if he moved production to the US, there's no benefit for him as the owner, like, sure, there might be some job creation as like, for the greater good of the economy, but there's no benefit for him as an owner. And then the last big FU is that he actually, because they send you a bill for the tariff, like, you don't, like, this isn't like, hey, let me fill out a form at some point later on down the road, and do, like, you pay for the tariff before you get your stuff. So it's like collected upon receipt of the good, otherwise you don't get the good. So he paid, but then the tariff was paused. So now, like, how's he get his money back? Independent of pricing specified on this particular part by the organization that he sells to. So he's getting into what Jack's going to next. He's got, somewhat limited recourse to go and do some pricing increases, due to this. So just like, in other words, like, it's one of those things where it's like, hey, may sound good on paper, I totally get like using it as a negotiating tool to try to get other countries to reduce tariffs on us, but I don't know, like, I actually don't think there were tariffs for Canada or Mexico. I think that was the whole point of the renegotiation of NAFTA, but I don't know that for a fact. I just think that's what it was. So it's really, so I told this guy, I'm like, dude, you need to send that picture, because he actually was at a dinner, a paid dinner with President Trump and his wife in between stints. Said, you need to text him that picture you guys together and say, dude, you're killing me.
He should. He
You know,
absolutely should.
fix this crap for me. So, anywho, I just see, you know, it's like, in other words, like, these aren't theoretical stories, or like, hey, something will, you know, maybe happen at some point in the future that may or may not impact me with the price creep. Now, this shit's going down like right now, you know, for people.
Yeah, and it's interesting that, there's really kind of two perspectives for every person, I think, or many people, which is the impact of you as a business person, business owner, and how's that going to impact your, your business financials. And then there's the personal impact, which is, okay, are you going to be able to do what you normally do, buy the normal things? Are you going to have conversations with your kids and say, okay, yeah, maybe not, we may not do that, or we may not, go wherever we normally go because it's going to cost more. Or, when you come home from, and this is an extreme, there may not be as much ice cream in their freezer, for example. That'll never happen because my daughter's being at NC State and they make their own ice cream, brings it home because she knows that that makes daddy happy. So
That's pretty good.
yes. So, but yeah, and so I think that people, yeah, we're seeing it, but I don't think we've seen the total results of these things. So for example, I'll give you a personal example that happened yesterday. So, happened to have an HVAC issue, an older one that needs to be completely replaced. And I'm always skeptical about that. I'm like, okay, they're trying to upsell, And they had a person come in, very educated, knew what she was talking about. She's maybe mid-20s or so, went to trade school, and she came in and did the assessment, wrote things down, showed me things, and said, okay, I'm going to give you all these recommendations, and this is how to Band-Aid fix it. But here's what's going to happen in the next several months when the temperature increases. I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, now do I take a leap of faith and believe her or do I not? But she also said that, and this is where I really got suspicious, that our price sheet has not changed. It's going to change because of tariffs. Um, she couched it more of, she used the word inflation, but she was meaning tariffs. She was meaning a
Yeah.
price increase due to, I guess, both inflation and the tariffs, but just knowing that it's coming and it hasn't come yet. And it's out of her control, but her bosses, her company has not implemented those increases, nor have the manufacturers of the equipment that she was recommending. And she recommended 3 different ones, and none of them have increased that, but they know that it's coming. So, again, personal issue as to, okay, well, end of the story is it's being installed today, because I saw the price differential, and then they also were throwing in little freebies like an extra circuit protector and that kind of thing. So, and I really don't want to come home one day and find my house is superheated because the capacitor, we were talking about that beforehand, capacitor goes. And they showed me the capacitor, and it's about ready to go, and the wire is charred. So anyway, too much detail. But my point is that, it impacts us in various ways. So impacts us, me personally, because it impacts the business that I'm dealing with. So similarly, it could have been, for work if, I wasn't in a building. So your office, right? So now you have an issue with your huge HVAC, and what are you going to do? Do you bite the bullet? Do you, knowing that that's coming? And I think that I possibly would have waited a little while longer to see how much more I could get out of that, and if it actually breaks, and hopefully the app works like it's supposed to and tell you, danger, danger, your house is overheating. But because of that price discussion, I was convinced to do things differently. So, and maybe I was upsold. Maybe they know that that's not going to happen for the next 2 months. They're probably going to got something out of it, but it's also more of peace of mind. Anyway, enough of that distraction. So what can you do in your contracts to deal with this issue? So again, force majeure, I still think that it should be addressed in there and as possible and maybe specifically defined. Yeah, I think that you'll find that the other side, whoever has the most to lose by a stoppage of performance, and it's usually the people that are receiving payment rather than the people that are providing stuff because they have manufactured their stuff and they want you to buy it. So it's usually the payor of the goods or services that it's going to have a larger impact on. And so that's an area, an option, an agreement. You can also put in price escalation limits. So you'll see that let's say in a lease agreement, we already have been exposed to those kind of things, maybe in a different form. So you have a lease and you might have an in term during the initial term escalation. Maybe it's based on CPI or something along those lines that will increase during the term. In other cases, it is a set number for the term and then an escalator in the renewal terms moving forward. So those things are capped. And so you might consider doing something similar to that in relation to price changes or other impact, shipping charges, increases, those kind of things that will put a cap, you implement a cap. The resistance there is going to be, well, I might be able to control some of that. But some of the other stuff, we use a third-party shipper. And so why should we as the manufacturer absorb that cost? It's just the cost of doing business. And so you get into negotiations about that. So dealing with price escalation clauses specifically for tariffs and allocating that risk on the front end. Just generally speaking, this is not legal advice, it's just discussion. An agreement to agree down the road is generally unenforceable. So when you see contracts that say, we'll figure it out down the road, but says in a legal way, any price increases is subject to the mutual written consent of the parties. Now, that specifically would say is that you're stuck with whatever it says, and there will be no changes unless you mutually agree. And then you have to rely upon things like impossibility or impracticability, what we talked about a few minutes ago. But what will happen is that you put those clauses in, and hopefully that protects against craziness. And sometimes it's percentages that the percent, it's a cap, and then the cap moves. So let's say it's 2% per year. So by the second year, it's 4% of the original price. So it escalates that way. There are also ways to put in provisions that are similar to force majeure clauses, but they're specifically related to delays and creating that tariff situation as an excusable delay. So it's not an excuse of performance, it's an excuse of delay. Had an interesting conversation with inside counsel for a client, and what we wanted in the contract was essentially, it was in the force majeure clause, but it was a delay of payment. It was not responsible for payment, which was interpreted as not ever being responsible for payment. Our perspective was being timely payment being excused, so that we still owe the money, but we may have to pay it down the road instead of on a timely basis. So in that instance, it was okay, we get it, and let's talk about what the delay looks like. And are you going to be charged interest? I had to fight that one too. I said, well, you're not a lender. And if it were credit terms and you were lending us money, not making us pay within 15, 30 days and say, it's net 60, whatever it may be, then you're a lender. But when we can't pay, we want to pay, but we can't pay, then that should be excused. So you get down to really, really granular on some of these things and what is on the excuse list, what is not on the excuse list. And so tariffs, you can do the same thing, which is, okay, is it that, do you put in language that says it has to have a material impact on your sellability of the ultimate product? So things like that. And then you can have specific tariff adjustment clauses that are focused specifically just on tariffs and not on anything else economically related to the contract. You're probably not going to see a lot of those. It's more going to be couched in general provisions, increases in costs, and that kind of thing. We're going to see, we have seen, and we'll see a lot of this in the construction industry and talking about change orders, and that, okay, mostly when you talk about change orders, it's from the perspective of the recipient of the services, so the owner of the construction that's being built. And so what you hear is that, or what you see is, okay, in the event that there is an increase in cost for materials or labor, then a change order is invoked. Sometimes it doesn't have to actually be invoked, but it's given that the price may increase by 5%, 10%, whatever it may be on a specific issue. So I think what you're going to see is the other way around, which is that if the person providing the services or receiving the services has to pay more, then, okay, there are going to be limitations on that. And there would have to be an actual physical, agreed upon, written, signed change order in order to be able to proceed with the sale of goods or sale of services if there's an impact on either party, not just one party. So you'll see more of that. There's discussion about just looking, and we're, the three of us have always been a proponent of and shared our perspective on always looking back every once in a while and seeing what you signed, what are the economic parameters, can you get a better deal? So really kind of being proactive in your relationships, your contractual relationships with those that you're paying money to. But on both sides, from what is coming to you and then what is being put out there. So if, you don't do a price increase, and hopefully the people who are installing my HVAC don't see this before I pay the bill, is that, okay, yeah, I mean, they probably should have made a change by now. And I think that many businesses have made changes by now, but others maybe not so much, because they're not feeling maybe necessarily the impact immediately, but they will feel it down the road, with respect to what they have in the queue, what they have in the funnel coming their way, which may be less. So maybe they should have charged higher prices now in March versus doing that in, maybe Q3 or maybe sometime during the summer in Q2. So those kind of things. So I'm going to stop there because I've hit you guys with a lot of things and see if there's any questions about any of that. But it comes down to good contract management, good management of relationships, and just taking a little bit of a deeper dive. So, yes, sir.
Adam.
So 2 questions, Jack, both, kind of involving contracts when you're talking about force majeure and stuff like that. I mean, practically speaking, the 2 scenarios where we see contracts with some sort of pricing locked in is, construction companies, did a bid and they're just not, they don't have the capability to pass on costs like this. What do they do?
So you're saying the scenario where there's been an increase and that they are already locked in via contract, or is there's just
Yeah,
no?
I've got, like, I just got, I mean, it'd be no different than like gas prices went up, and I didn't include a provision to do it. In other words, like, a lot of people got smart and kind of put in a fuel surcharge, but this is like,
Yeah.
Nobody was really thinking through a contract that was awarded a year ago, that this would be an item, that would be in it.
Yeah, and so as a side note, prospectively at the time of renewal of the agreement, then you should start thinking about those things. You should start thinking about those things at the time, at the renewal point. So if you have an evergreen contract that says that unless, which has negative notice, which means that unless you notify, one of the parties notifies the other within 30 days, 60 days, it's usually not as short as 30 days. It's usually 60, 90 days before the end of the current term, which many times is, a calendar year. So by the end of the year, then it automatically renews at that price. So that's a point of negotiation. So yeah, my initial response is looking for the points of negotiation at certain times. And it may be that okay, if it were the case that you used name brand and that's what you were installing, and now you're going to have to drop down to the next level, lower level of brand, and you would rather not do that, because let's say that something happens, is it the machine or is it the installer at that point, right? And you don't know necessarily. I've been told that, again, part of the sale yesterday on the HVAC thing is that many HVAC systems, it's not that the system is defective, it's how they are installed, and not properly installed, not properly insulated, in this day and age and some of it is materials. But so thinking about that you go to the customer and say, okay, this is what we're going to have to do. Or you just take the business risk and say, this is what I have to do in order to compensate for that. And I can't charge more. So I'm going to have to use materials that are sufficient, but not the ones that I really like to use, because that gives me a better competitive advantage in that maybe that one lasts. Okay, so you have a product that is warranted for 2 years, and it probably lasts 5. Hopefully this compressor lasts more than 10. That, okay, the newer one, the different one, the one that's lower, may still have a 2-year warranty, but it may only go for 3 years instead of 5, or 4 years instead of 5. And then they're going to be looking to you as the service provider, as the installer, as the provider of these goods, to say, hey, what's going on? So, but you know, other than it being a catastrophic situation, then it's going to be difficult to use principles of equity to over, like, impossibility of performance. It's not impossible, it's just more expensive for you, and your profit margin is decreasing. That is not impractical or impossible. That is just economics. And
Yeah.
so, doing that. Now, the nuclear kind of button in this scenario, which I was also reading about, is talking about bankruptcy. I mean, if you want to get out of your contracts and have an orderly liquidation, but I mean, that is a heavy black mark on your business soul to carry around. I mean, it's going to impact your ability to borrow money down the road. It's going to impact your reputation. And, when things go badly, that'll bubble up to the surface with an unhappy customer. Hey, world, did you know that they went through bankruptcy 4 years ago and they're
Yeah.
still doing crappy stuff? So those are the risks that you take. But um, and then kind of the last option is to find bad behavior outside of that to try to invalidate the contract and your ability or your obligation to pay, and basically allege, hopefully not fabricate, but allege a breach, and then have them say to themselves on the other side, it's worth negotiating an adjustment rather than paying lawyers a ton of money to litigate this. Now, I'm not a proponent of doing that strategy. I think that is not what the judicial system is about. But I've been on the other side of that, where it is, all right, I look at something, I'm like, this is all BS. And then you have a conversation, a very private conversation with opposing counsel. I'm like, what does your client want? It's like, he thinks he's overpaying. Okay, now that I know, let's focus on that. What can we do to fix that? Or if you're the supplier, well, my client feels like that, you're not, because of circumstances, that you're not paying enough money. Okay, well, let's talk about that. Let's not, talk about all this other BS that you say, well, you know, that this product was defective, it wasn't delivered on time, you know, the services were, you know, 80% correct, those kind of things. So focus on that. So anyway, that's just hopefully that answers your question in a roundabout way.
So we had another interesting question that came up, Jack, that, you know, may not impact some of the people listening, but, you know, we got similar story of a, you know, company that's got, you know, a foreign owned affiliate that they buy things from. You know, they just, you know, you're always trying to get money back and forth as tax efficiently as possible. So a lot of times what you do is you look at, well, what should I price goods and services to myself for, which is called transfer pricing. And, you know, before all this happened, they're like, oh, I know what we could do. We could slap a royalty on, you know, for intellectual property associated with the right to, you know, use and install these products, meaning that the parent that was in another country wanted to implement a royalty fee as a way of getting money out of the US without having to pay a foreign dividend. You know, perfectly acceptable strategy. But for, you know, hey, is that royalty decoupable from the product, you know, and now you got your tariff again. So you got any thoughts on intellectual property in the subject of tariffs?
Yeah, I don't have, I can't provide any guidance on that directly yet because it's still an evolving thing. It's exactly as you said. I mean, is it able to be separated? It is legally separated. A lot of times you'll have a separate entity that owns the intellectual property and licenses it. There's a lot of factors that go into it, and that's the nice way of saying it depends. And the reason why it depends is that, is this linear, meaning that, okay, it's they're manufactured in Europe and the main importer is in the US, and therefore the main licensee is in the US, or is this something that is you know, part of a global enterprise where the same entity that owns the intellectual property, is licensing it into South America countries, to its joint venture partners, into Europe, into Asia, into, you know, other places. So, you know, that the transfer pricing, and I was going to bring that up, but I'm not an expert on that, other than I know that when there's international transactions and it is essentially a parent and the subsidiary or joint venture, that you need to take a look at that when you're paying yourself for stuff. So you're drop shipping and, you know, you're paying directly the manufacturer, or, you know, where it's following the dollar essentially, and you need to do it properly. So that's why I know I'm out of my lane when I speak any more in depth about that. But yes, that is a potential method, but it hasn't been litigated yet, as far as I know, to be able to separate the two, at least under the new tariffs, and how they're imposed. But I'm sure that it will be looked at in more depth, because it is a method to get around paying tariffs on the total purchase price of of whatever it is that is being purchased. If you can extract that cost or that value out and say that's not taxable. But similarly, I was also reading about this, is what if you are a US manufacturer, and you actually are putting together parts or things together, or if you are a wholesaler, or if, you know, wherever you are in the commerce stream, but it's component based. Or maybe you get a product that isn't completely finished, and you are able to finish it yourself if you get certain parts from a different place that is not one of the places on a tariff list. So can you reduce the costs and the impacts of tariffs based on what I want to say, the erector set that you're putting together. The thing that you're putting together, or the thing that you're purchasing as a service provider, or the parts that you get if you're a repair, into kind of repair kind of service, the parts that you get acquire to use in your repairs. So thinking about the sourcing of where you get stuff, and you may have to change your method of operation to purposefully, methodically get things from different places.
So just a thought. I mean, who knows about what this is really going to be, but um, think back to COVID and when we saw massive jumps in lumber. And like, I mean, that was supply demand and other things that were coming into play, but it was real impact right then. Some people had to delay their projects. Some of them just had to like pony up and realize, okay, well, I got hit with a bad time. But just my hypothesis, and I could be way wrong. I mean, Trump likes, if you and I haven't read The Art of the Deal fully, but nonetheless, he likes to go with extremes and then negotiate into the middle somehow. And it seems like I, I'd be very surprised if we're dealing with tariffs in another year that it's like this. I think he's using this as a negotiating tactic. But what do we do in the meantime? How do we navigate it through it? And Jack, just so you know, I think that you made the wise choice because in buying that air conditioner, because when it's 95 degrees and 90% humidity down there, and all of a sudden it's 85 degrees inside and the humidity is high, and you're trying to sleep at midnight, you will pay a lot more because pain, like the higher the pain, the more you're willing to pay. So anyway, by the way, one other thing, egg prices, I just checked on it. They've dropped down. They've dropped $2.70. Like, okay, I haven't been buying eggs. They dropped to $4.15. So they were at 6.85 a dozen. Holy moly. I mean, that's crazy. No wonder some of our restaurant clients, and one that's a big breakfast one that has franchises all over the place, yeah, they really hit them. So I'm getting to some of the chat because now we got a couple more things rolling in here. Thanks, Will, for weighing in. But then, Joe, if you're buying a product from Asia and you are purchasing from a US distributor, it could be a good time to go direct to the manufacturer. Oh, good point. Great point. I love that creativity. The other thing is Joe has mentioned here, well, boys, my seat at, oh gosh, I don't even want to read it. Like, Joe, too much information. So his stomach is talking to, so we need to get local girls best wings in the world. No, I'm not even going to go there with that.
I think
Sorry,
people
Joe.
know where he's going now, based on that.
Yeah.
So, this is also an opportunity for I don't want to say selling B brands, but there are companies out there that spend a lot of time marketing, business development, putting their commercials on the Super Bowl, NCAA, and there are brands out there, companies out there that sell just as good stuff or maybe even better. It's just that they're not known. What will happen is people will start shopping. They will get on Google, they'll get on Amazon, they will look for, and they will rely upon the results of the comments and everything else, the reviews. They will do their own independent research, and they may come to the conclusion that this is we need to make a change. That even more formally and specifically, the people that are in charge of procurement within companies, they are charged with finding the best deals that they can within reason that is not going to sacrifice quality. And so if they're out there looking, and you better believe that that activity has increased over the course of time. So if you could put yourself in their line of sight, however you do that, whether it's being on Amazon, whether it is, okay, firing up that email campaign and talking about how and doing that comparative analysis between product X and your product, maybe a good time to step that up, to get out there more, because the opportunity is there more so than it being kind of like, okay, well, it was good enough. It's probably priced the same way. So you have procurement officers that are just like, good enough. I'm not on anybody's radar because the costs aren't significantly, or it's what other people are going through. So it's just kind of the nature of doing business. But if you can be a hero and go back, and especially if that person's compensation is tied to efficiency and what they save the company and performance based, then that is pretty significant, can be significant and motivating to get people to reach out to you and see if your product is good enough for them.
Yeah. I especially love Joe. Joe, you've been on here for 5 years, so thank you, and we do appreciate you. But I love your creativity, and if you think back, go back to COVID again, because it's been 5 years. Um, Everybody had to get pretty doggone creative. We had to get resourceful. We had to do daily stand-ups at our firm, and so. Um, Complacency is not your friend in any situation in business. So I think that just seeing that, I'm like, yeah, it's an opportunity to be creative. So, Adam, you have any other additional thoughts here before we start winding it down?
No, it's a bag of poo, uncertainty sucks. So wish there were better answers.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to just say one thing about that. Uncertainty is life. When we think that we've got it together, we don't. We're all vulnerable. We just aren't always cognizant of it. Man, we've seen that a lot. And the other thing that I would say is certainty sometimes can lead to complacency. And I think that we've seen governmental bloat because we were complacent and like, same thing. The problem was there was a lot of crappy stuff. I was with a guy early this morning, and he was showing me pictures of this very amazing island where he's going barracuda fishing and all, and like these barracudas were ginormous. It's amazing. I said, well, whose place is this? Because it's obviously a very expensive place. Oh, retired FBI. I'm like, interesting. How does somebody that's retired from the FBI have a multi-million-dollar place like that? I'm like, I don't know. But um, I just think that sometimes complacency doesn't necessarily serve us well when we think that, oh, well, it's good. It's predictable. Life is not, it's just not. So that's one of the reasons I think all three of us love working with privately held businesses and their owners. We all are, um, because you take a risk and there are some rewards, but there's a lot of bumps along the way too. But we're in the chop with you. So if there's any other questions that you guys have, all right, here we go, John. Yes, I like that attitude, John. Uncertainty can feel uncomfortable, but it opens up opportunities. Skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it's been. Good Gretzky quote there. But that's so true. And that is what separates most entrepreneurs from people that try to be safe. And what I experienced in Fortune 100 companies, the ones that are still there. And I'm not bashing them is just like that wasn't my cup of tea. Like, so I like the rumble of business, and you just have to have some embracing of the uncertainty because there are opportunities in that. And the people that I've known that were extremely wealthy in billionaire category, um, they were they saw opportunities where everybody else was fleeing, and they ran into it, and they just, you know, it's pretty amazing to see, and in very unsexy things like rivets and and fasteners and in timber, like very unsexy things, canneries, pretty amazing. So,
And
any
I have
other?
two parting comments.
Yeah.
First, I just sent to you a link. I was just informed this morning that my labor and employment colleagues in the Charlotte office are putting on a in-person seminar at Legion Brewing South Park. Although it's a
Ah,
morning session, I guess you could drink beer if you wanted to in the morning. But um,
sounds
so
terrible.
yeah, I know, right? And April 9th from 8 to 11. And the topics are most common FLSA mistakes and how to avoid them, AI and hiring and data privacy in the workplace, and establishing, well, this is related to immigration a little bit, but, and the thing is that they're, yeah, I'm sure there'll be an open forum to ask them other questions for guidance, not legal advice. So if you wouldn't mind sharing that with everyone, that link that I just sent to you, Gary. The other kind of
Right.
substantive comment is that one thing that I did read is in relation to your differing or your changing economic situation with respect to your P&Ls and your financials, everything else. There was a suggestion in an article to look at your loans and your loan covenants that, if there is a requirement for certain ratios in your loan and you start adjusting those somewhat inadvertently, but you're taking on less, you have less customers, your revenue drops, there is the possibility that you walk yourself into a covenant violation. So sometimes going to your lender and saying, hey, we're having this issue, and asking for, okay, a little bit of grace versus after the fact. But it really depends on your banking relationship and what you're willing to risk. Is it to ask for forgiveness after the fact, or is it to ask for a little bit of grace on the front end, knowing that that's where you're trending towards? And I hadn't thought about that before until I read that. I was like, okay, interesting kind of link between, you think that, okay, as long as you're paying your loans, and your mortgages and everything else, everything's fine. So
All right. Well, we're at the bewitching hour, or hey, it's halfway through the workday supposedly. What we will do, we'll put this up on the BGW CPA YouTube channel later on this afternoon. Shoemaker has their own as well. And I have taken your link and I've asked Jamie to include that on one of our upcoming communiques to this audience and beyond. So that'd be great. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Adam, it's always good to see you in a collared shirt, but don't get used to it, man. You get too formal, and I don't know how I'm gonna behave around you. So,
Right.
all right, you guys
all right,
have a
no
wonderful
worries.
day.
All
Thank you
right.
guys.
All right, bye bye.